Shenzhen, China. It's the peak of China manufacturing. It's known for its drone deliveries, robo-taxis, futuristic skyscrapers. But just in 1980, this place was best known for its oysters. Shenzhen was a string of fishing villages on the south coast of China with 300,000 people. The average wage was $2 a month, and for as long as anyone could remember, that's how it had always been. Today, Shenzhen has 18 million people. It's home to BYD, DJI, the world's third largest stock exchange, and it has more skyscrapers than New York City and a GDP that's larger than Switzerland. In Shenzhen, they have a saying, you're a Shenzhen local the moment you're here, because nobody's from here, everyone arrived. This is a story of how a city that didn't exist 40 years ago became the world's most technologically advanced city. But it's also a story of how one city became a blueprint of everything China is today. Building the world's largest high-speed rail network, building a new city the size of Chicago every year, becoming the world's largest EV manufacturer, all of it started here. Shenzhen wasn't the result of modern China, Shenzhen built modern China. And the way it got built is one of the most insane decisions of the 20th century. In 1979, it wasn't even called Shenzhen yet, it was known as Boan County. It was full of rice paddies and fishing boats, and you made $2 a month and farmed the same way as your grandparents. But if you just looked south, you could see something strange. The lights of Hong Kong, which was one of the wealthiest cities in Asia, a place where an ordinary office mater made 100 times what you made. It was only 3 miles away, you could walk there in an hour, but you couldn't go. A fence separated you from the other world. It had barbed wire, checkpoints, and soldiers. And for the people who lived in Boan, that's how it was going to be for the rest of their lives. This same piece of land, 45 years later, would have 18 million people on it, making China's highest wages and some of the most advanced technology on Earth. What has happened between these two images might be one of the fastest, biggest economic transformations in recorded history. So how did they do it, and how did they do it in less than one human lifetime? To understand how China pulled this off, you have to understand where they were starting from. In 1976, the year Mao Zedong died, China was a country of about 950 million people. Roughly 95% of them lived in the countryside farming by hand, and China had a GDP that was lower than Bangladesh at the time. There was no private business, no private property. A factory worker in Shanghai made, on a good year, $40 a month. And if you wanted to move to a different city, you needed permission from the state, and permission was usually denied. The country had just survived one of the most chaotic decades in modern history. It was called the Cultural Revolution. Professors were humiliated in public, millions of educated people were sent to the countryside to farm, and millions died. 1970s China, by almost every measurable metric, was broken. But what happened after Mao died changed the course of human history. And it started with one of the most unlikely leaders of the 20th century. His name was Deng Xiaoping. And Deng was a communist. He had been with the party since the 1920s. But unlike Mao, Deng cared less about ideology and cared more about one question: what actually works? What's crazy is he had been purged from the party 3 separate times. 3 times they sent him to work in a tractor factory as punishment, and 3 times he came back. In 1976, Deng was already 72 years old. Most people thought his career was over. Instead, he was about to remake China. And within just 2 years, Deng became the most powerful man in China. And when he looked at the country that he inherited, he came to a major conclusion: that Mao had been wrong. But he wasn't public about it. You of course couldn't say that publicly. But privately, Deng looked at the numbers and realized that if China kept the way it was going, the Communist Party would not survive. The country was just too poor. The neighbors, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, were all pulling ahead, so something had to change. But changing an economic system in a country of almost 1 billion people is not something you just announce. So Deng didn't announce anything. Instead, he ran an experiment. So if you're running a country of 1 billion people and you think the foundation of your political system might be wrong, how do you even test that? Well, you can't just change the rules for everyone overnight. And with the Mao loyalists still in the picture, they're going to be waiting for any excuse to say, see, capitalism doesn't work, we told you so. And they'd be right to, so Deng couldn't just try capitalism nationwide. But Deng could do something else, and in 1980 he did something completely unprecedented. He decided to build a sandbox. The logic worked like this: you pick a place where you didn't have much to lose, and you change the rules only in that one place. But everywhere else, the other billion people keep living under the old system. If the experiment works, you quietly expand it, and if the experiment blows up, you shut it down and pretend like nothing ever happened. Now the question was, where to put it? Deng had his eyes on a poor fishing village at the edge of the country far from the party in Beijing. But the place that would eventually become Shenzhen was not random. Remember, it was 3 miles from Hong Kong. Everything Deng wanted to learn, foreign capital, manufacturing, management, global trade, was sitting right across the river. And what's wild is Deng didn't just bet on one town, he bet on 4. Deng fenced off those 4 towns, and inside the fence, the rules changed. Foreign companies were allowed to invest, private companies could operate, wages were set by the market, and workers could be hired and fired. Outside the fence, everything stayed exactly the same: communism, state-owned industry, central planning, the old system. These zones were in many ways a different country inside China. They had fences, checkpoints, and guards, and if you wanted to enter, you needed permits. They were called special economic zones, and 3 of those 4 zones would have modest growth, but one of them was about to explode. The one we'd come to call Shenzhen. The deal Deng cut with the Communist Party was like this: we're going to test capitalism in these 4 fenced-off towns, and if it doesn't work, we'll just pretend it never happened. Deng had a phrase he repeated publicly for years: it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. Meaning, we don't care if the country is socialist or capitalist, we just want to stop being poor. For a Chinese communist leader in 1980, that was crazy to say, but for the architect of modern China, it was the founding sentence. The experiment worked, and the sandbox logic paid off exactly the way Deng had hoped. Shenzhen's GDP grew by 50 times in its first decade. Foreign companies poured in, and Hong Kong investors crossed the border with briefcases of cash, and factories went up overnight. In 1985, the city built a 50-story skyscraper at a pace of 1 floor every 3 days. The phrase Shenzhen speed entered the Chinese vocabulary. And when Deng visited Shenzhen in 1984, he used exactly that phrase to justify what came next. 14 more coastal cities got the same treatment, including Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Tianjin. By 1988, the entire island of Hainan was a special economic zone. By 1992, the rules were extending inland, and by 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the original fence was effectively gone. The experiment had eaten itself, and the special economic zone had become the entire country. I'm going to show you what came out of that fence, and specifically what came out of Shenzhen. Shenzhen became home to BYD, and today BYD is the largest electronic vehicle company on Earth. They now outsell Tesla, not just in China, but globally. The new BYD factory under construction in Zhengzhou will be, when finished, larger than the city of San Francisco. Shenzhen also became home to DJI, which now controls over half the global commercial drone market. Pretty much every drone you see flying in America, including drones used by police departments, is Chinese, and most of them come from this one city. And the reason a company like DJI could happen in Shenzhen is because Shenzhen evolved into the densest hardware ecosystem on the planet. Camera sensors, batteries, motors, chips, it's all here and sometimes even in the same neighborhood. Go to the Huazhongbei electronics market in Shenzhen and you can buy every component needed to assemble a phone or computer in an afternoon. And all of this came from a fishing village that in 1979 wasn't even called Shenzhen yet. The irony is Deng's experiment wasn't really about fencing capitalism in, it was about fencing communism out. The capitalist zones that were supposed to be the exception became the rule. The fence was supposed to keep the experiment contained, but instead the experiment ate the country. And what started inside Shenzhen's fence eventually scaled into the largest manufacturing system in human history. China today makes more things than any country has ever made. #1 in steel, #1 in shipbuilding, #1 in car exports, #1 in solar panels, #1 in batteries, and #1 in robots. China today even has something called dark factories, production facilities that run 24/7 with almost no humans on the floor. Factories where robots build products for other robots. China built the world's largest high-speed rail network from scratch in just 12 years. They built the world's largest highway network, the world's largest hydroelectric dam, and the world's largest train station. China's shipbuilding capacity is now 230 times the United States. What is insane is China now pours more concrete every 3 years than the United States poured during the entire 20th century. In the year 2000, if you looked at a map of each country's largest trading partner, the answer was almost always the United States. But in 2024, if you look at that same map, the answer for 124 countries is no longer the United States, it's China. At some point in the last 15 years, the direction of global trade reversed, and most of us missed the day it happened. Which brings us to the question is, how did China actually build all of this so fast? To put it simply, the Chinese state can just do things that democracies cannot do. Not easier, not faster, things democracies cannot do at all. It can command land. If the Chinese government decides a high-speed rail line should run through a specific valley, it runs through that valley. There's no lawsuit, there's no 10-year environmental review, and there's no community meeting that kills the project. Yeah, I'm looking at you, the California high-speed rail. China can mobilize capital at a scale without asking markets for permission. It can decide that batteries are a strategic industry, that BYD and CATL should dominate it, and then flood those companies with subsidies and low-cost infrastructure until they win. It can move 300 million people off farms and into cities in 30 years because the political system does not require their individual consent. It can build a 57-story skyscraper in 19 days because no one will file suit to stop it. It can pick a city, Shenzhen, and decide it will exist, and then it exists. I'm not trying to say the Chinese system is better than ours, and I'm not telling you it's worse, I'm just telling you what it is. The Chinese system produces outcomes that democracies cannot produce. It also produces costs that democracies will not accept. And both of those things are true at the same time. But the cars, the drones, the dark factories, the trade flip exist because of a state that can allocate capital, command labor, and build infrastructure at a scale and speed the rest of us genuinely cannot match. And it's a story that the West has been quiet about for over 40 years, and for reasons that are about to matter a lot. For the last 40 years, Chinese foreign policy has followed the fine words of Deng: hide your strength, bide your time. Deng's instructions to his successors were pretty blunt: do not announce what you are building. Do not threaten the West, do not claim leadership of anything, and let Western analysts keep calling you a factory. Let them keep calling you a factory, and let them keep assuming that they are ahead. But here's the twist: both America and China have been invested in the illusion that China wasn't already the world's strongest economy. America wants to look untouchable, so Washington has downplayed China's numbers. And China just wants to look harmless, so Beijing sandbagged its own numbers, and for 4 decades, both sides sold the world the same lie. That's why there's so many misconceptions of what China is today. None of this is new. It's been happening in plain sight for nearly 40 years. The only thing that is new is that it's no longer possible to hide. In October of 2017, President Xi Jinping gave a 3.5-hour speech, and in it he said something that every Chinese watcher noticed and most Western media didn't cover. He said, "It is time for us to take center stage in the world." Xi had just basically ended the Deng Doctrine, and the hiding was now over. Which is when you start to see the things that have been quiet for a long time start to become a reality. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, where China funded ports, rail lines, and highways across 70 different countries. Or the Chinese trade agreements that quietly route around the US dollar. Then you have the digital yuan or the petro yuan, where China doesn't need US dollars to buy oil. Everything China did the last 40 years was deliberately made quiet. 40 years of a country telling the world on purpose to look somewhere else. And this is why most of the world is not fully calibrated on what China is today. Some of IShowSpeed's most popular live streams was on his trip to China. Suddenly, the country Deng spent 40 years hiding was live streamed to the world. A 20-year-old with a phone did what 40 years of journalism couldn't do. He simply just showed people what he saw. So China was able to pull this off because of a combination of 3 things. 1, a 1980 experiment that was supposed to be a small thing but instead became the whole country. 2, 40 years of a deliberate strategy of being underestimated. And 3, an engineering state that can just do things at a speed and scale that no democracies can match. So China's not rising, they arrived. And by most metrics that will actually matter in the 21st century, manufacturing, EVs, drones, batteries, robotics, trade, they are already ahead. Most people don't want to accept actually how capitalist China is today. They didn't just build a stronger economy, they built an entirely different model. One that took parts of capitalism that worked, kept the parts of state control that the West gave up on, and ran it for 40 years without an election cycle interrupting the plan. The oysters in Shenzhen became drones, the salt flats became factories, and 300,000 people became 18 million people. China today is a completely different country than it was in 1980, and the 21st has 2 centers of gravity now, not 1. You can even see how the world's economic center of gravity has completely shifted in 20 years back to Asia after 100 years of being in the West, mostly because of China. So at some point, we all need to accept what China has become. I'm Jake Explains, and my goal is to explain how the world's changing and where the world's going, so make sure you subscribe for more.